Welcome back to the Taiken Ramen channel. Today we're revisiting the recipe that started it all on this channel, spicy miso tonkotsu. For those of you who make ramen at home, there's probably one recipe that's really good or that your guests really enjoy. For me, it's spicy miso tonkotsu, and I try not to make it all the time because I just don't want it to be overplayed. But today, I'm getting back to my roots, so let's get cooking. We'll start with the tare. There's some pretty drastic differences in elevations from the original miso tare recipe to now. First things first is the miso blend. In the original recipe, and I'll put the tare over here, I used all red miso. If we were comparing this to beers, red miso is kind of like a stout, really strong, heavy flavors. And then you have something called white miso, which has a similar flavor, but it's much lighter, nuttier, and more delicate. So think like an ale if it was a beer. If you're watching this channel, then you probably love the taste of miso, most of us do, but at the same time, I wanted a lot of the other components in the tare to shine, so instead of doing 2 full cups of red miso paste, I did 1.5 cups of red miso and 1/2 cup of white miso paste, just to tone it down a touch. I still used 8 cloves of garlic, but check this out. I was at the farmer's market and I found this variety of garlic called ajo rojo. It's both sweeter and a little spicier than your standard garlic, so that was an easy sell. 8 cloves of that go in the new recipe. Last time I used white onion, and this time I did a combination of 5 whites from spring onions. The spring onions bring a really nice sweet flavor to the tare. And then I also threw in a tablespoon of dried onion flakes. These do a good job of really concentrating that onion flavor, and I learned about these when I made my vegan ramen video last year. To round out the vegetables, I threw in a pinch of wasabi microgreens for some exhilarating spicy notes. And now we're onto the soy sauce. I still use 2 tablespoons of soy sauce, but this time I used usakuchi soy sauce. I learned in my shoyu tares video about the different kinds of shoyus, usakuchi being high in salt and lighter in color. For spices, I went with 1 teaspoon of Himalayan rock salt for minerality, 1 teaspoon ichimi togarashi for classic ramen spice flavor, and 1.5 teaspoons of brown sugar for some really rich sweet notes. For complexity, I added 1/4 teaspoon of rice wine vinegar, and 2 teaspoons of tahini for a little bit of smoothing out. I blended things in the food processor until it was all uniform, and then I stored it in the fridge until it was time to serve. Now, I also made a dashi out of some ocean and earthy components. Miso is great, we all love miso, but the soup did need a little more dimension, something a touch more complex. This is nothing too complicated, a couple of shiitake mushrooms and sheets of kombu in a jar of water. It sat in the fridge for about 3 days until it was fully steeped. And then with that tare and dashi, I was feeling pretty confident that we were in the right direction. So that's tare complete. For the noodles, there were all sorts of lessons learned. First off, I went with a higher hydration, 38% hydration noodle. Those higher hydration noodles tend to be a little softer, and I have become a big softie when it comes to the noodles. I made them with bread flour that I got from my local mill thanks to the farm to table video. I used a dark rye adjunct to add a little bit of texture, and then I also adjuncted with riboflavin for that nice yellow color, and I made these with smoked sea salt rather than standard sea salt. That gives them just a touch of a charred taste, and that made them kind of like cousins to the smoked chashu that I'm making later in this video. I used a blend of sodium and potassium konsuis in order to give the noodles a little bit more of a bite rather than just being soft and chewy, and I cut them with my 2mm square noodle cutter. After going on the Ramen in Japan podcast last winter, I got called out for not doing enough tomomi noodles by Darth Ramen Wednesday. So after letting these noodles rest for 24 hours, I gave them a gentle tomomi massage. That gave them those curls so that they'd be really good vessels of the soup, the tare, and the little onion rings that I was planning to cut up in there. The noodles rested at room temperature for 4 days before serving, and that made them extra bouncy when I finally did get around to eating them. They only boiled for 1 minute before they were ready to go. That's noodles complete. For the broth, I decided to make a nice fatty tonkotsu to envelop all of those punchy miso flavors. And if you have watched much of this channel, then you have seen me make a ton of tonkotsu. The thing about it is you have to have a pretty big batch of pork neck bones and water, so you always end up making more than you need, and I freeze off all my extras, and it really only is good for maybe a year in the freezer. Anyway, considering I really wanted to zero in on the tare, the dashi, the aroma oil, and the toppings of this bowl, it seemed like a good occasion to just pull some pork out of the vault. Easy as, that's broth complete. Now that I had the broth, noodles, tare, and dashi down, I had a pretty basic miso ramen on my hands, but this has to be spicy miso, so I had to heat it up, and the aroma oil is just what's gonna do the trick. I've made Szechuan aroma oil on the channel before. I've purchased some online. I think if you're gonna just make Szechuan oil, you might as well go get it online, but I wanted to elevate this component by making it a little more custom, and I'm gonna show you a technique for how to do that. You start by conglomerating all of the flavors that you want in a heat-proof jar. For me, that was about 6 tablespoons of Szechuan chili flake, 1 tablespoon sesame for some nutty flavors, 4 cloves of crushed garlic, a few inches of peeled ginger, 2 spring onion greens, and finally some wasabi microgreens. You'll notice this is similar in a lot of ways to the tare. That's intentional, just like the noodles have little notes to the pork later. We want everyone to be in harmony here. Next, I added 6 tablespoons of Szechuan peppercorns to some shimmering canola oil, and I waited until their texture went from very smooth to kind of bumpy. They started to turn a little bit brown to black and started to smoke. At this point, I strained the peppercorns out of the oil, and I strained the oil directly into that heat-proof jar with all the components. And as the oil falls over all the components, it just cooks all of those flavors right into itself, which is great. I used 2 cups of oil, and once that was all in the components jar, I gave it a stir. If you did this right, your oil has turned a nice bright red thanks to the Szechuan pepper flakes. And then all of the beautiful smells from that jar started wafting up. In particular, I was getting a lot of garlic and a lot of wasabi. I let this hang out in the fridge for about 3 days until serving. At the time of serving, I strained out all of the solid components, and the rest is sitting in my fridge right now. That's aroma oil complete. The chashu was the next component. I learned how to smoke this in my farm to table ramen video, and I actually used some of the pork belly that I had butchered and tied up in that video. I made more pork roll than I needed, so I just put the raw stuff in a Ziploc bag and I threw it in my freezer until right now. I pulled out this frozen log of pork and immediately cursed myself for how I had put this in the bag. I don't know why I didn't just cut it shorter earlier, but the twine was on it now, so I was committed. And I started by marinating it very carefully. I added to the bag 1 head of peeled garlic, a generous squeeze of ginger paste, a few good squeezes of local honey, a couple tablespoons of soy sauce, a few teaspoons of salt and pepper, a little water to make sure everything covered the pork, and then the greens of the spring onions from the tare. Once all the components were in the bag, I had to use clothespins actually to get the air out and make sure that it stayed sealed. And then I marinated it in the fridge for 2 days. After 2 days, I pulled it out of the marinade and I put it in a 180-degree smoker, and it smoked for 4 hours. And then after that, I bumped the smoker temperature up to 250 degrees Fahrenheit, and it stayed there for about another 4 hours until the internal temperature registered 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's all per my buddy Adam's recipe. In order for pork to be safe to eat, you actually don't have to take it all the way to 200 degrees. But the benefit of doing that is it gets that really melt in your mouth texture because the collagen breaks down at higher temperatures. Go figure. After it was cooked and it had a very nice bark on the outside, I put it in the fridge overnight for about 8 hours, and then the next day I was able to slice it into about 2 centimeter thick slices. Before serving, I also decided to torch this down with my Iwatani torch, but if you wanted to make this without torching the pork, that's completely acceptable as well. Don't let me tell you how to live your dreams. With that, the protein is complete. For additional toppings, I went with a soft-boiled egg. I actually repeated the marinade from the last video, the chicken and waffles egg. I had done a marinade of soy sauce, water, and honey rather than mirin on that chicken and waffles egg to make it more breakfasty. And I thought the flavor was actually really nice, kind of like a more Americanized ramen egg. And that's really what this whole channel is about. Like, what's the face of American ramen? So wonderful. For second topping, I took some spring onions from the farmer's market and cut those into tiny little rings. This isn't really like a recipe lessons learned, but my eyes get so sensitive when cutting onions. And I used to skydive quite a bit, and I still have my old skydiving helmet. So I threw that on to make sure that I could get my onion slices as precise and thin as possible. If you have swimming goggles, those work great too in a pinch. And my final lesson learned on this bowl is really about editing. I know that this bowl probably would have played nice with some thick menma slices, maybe some buttercorn or some kind of fancy garnish. But what I personally struggle with as a ramen chef is overdoing it. So I hung up my apron and decided to just stop and plate it as is and let the flavors speak for themselves. And so that is extra components complete. When plating this ramen, I started with 2 tablespoons of the ocean and earthy dashi, followed by about 1 rounded tablespoon, so about 1.5 tablespoons of the miso tare. Then I added 500 milliliters of steaming tonkotsu, followed by the noodles. And this next part was challenging because I normally pack the bowl to the brim, but what I went with was a minimalist scoop of some very carefully cut onions, 2 delicate slices of my smoked and torched chashu, and finally 1/2 of my honey marinated soft-boiled egg. I then added 100 milliliters of my custom Szechuan aroma oil and then left the bowl in peace. In my opinion, the simplicity of this bowl has an undeniable appeal. I was very proud of the plating and all of the lessons learned that manifested into these components that had a lot of time and thought put into them, but didn't feel like overdoing it. I found the noodles to be really nice vessels for all of that flavor, and I really liked how the punchiness of the miso tare was turned down a little bit, and then all of the other components, in particular the sweet notes from the spring onions and the garlic, and then the spicy notes also from the garlic but from the wasabi, really got a chance to sing. The broth and tare really did fit together like hand in glove. What I would criticize is that I did not put near enough dashi in because those ocean and earthy elements were just barely present but sort of lost. I thought that the honey marinated egg was just a touch lighter than your standard ramen egg that you might find in a shop in Japan, but the marinade still did a very good job of pulling off all of that eggy smell from it. So I thought that that was really nice and a touch mild, but it was nice. And the show stealer was the pork. Hard to argue with it. You kind of knew going in. The pork got a custom roll and then it got marinated, smoked, sliced carefully, and then torched. So much effort went into it. Of course, it was going to be delicious. But yeah, the pork was an absolute hit. I know it's annoying when people on the internet make this food that you don't get to taste and then tell you, oh, it was so good, it was so amazing. And I do pride myself in giving myself honest reviews when the food is just bad. Ugh. Something's not right, just atrocious. I probably wouldn't do it again. It just went completely sideways. But I do gotta say, this bowl was a hit. I already had a pretty solid foundational recipe to go on, and it wasn't just guesses. These were lessons learned from a lot of hard work, trials, tribulations. Extremely satisfying to dig into something like that though, and of course, this was an easy entrant into the Clean Plate Club. And I couldn't be more excited to think about where this recipe is going to be the next time I give it a shot. So there you have it. That's another month in the books. Thanks so much for joining me. It was a pleasure cooking with you. As usual, please consider subscribing for more. See ya.